That's a good one. Yeah, I have a 2000 Lincoln. They want to sell me with 250,000 miles. They want to sell me an extended warranty. Okay, let's try that. Okay. Oh, that was my lips. Okay. Well, the song sets the stage for the conversation today, for a conversation Jesus wants to have with us. A hard conversation. The topics are difficult. I call this Broken Promises, Broken Hearts. And what we just heard, the Peter, Paul, and Mary song, is about the way love is intended to be between a man and a woman. Yet, so often, and it's been all along, but certainly we can see it in our own culture, that broken promises lead to broken hearts. And that's what Jesus wants us to look at in a way that will help us to avoid that happening. And so, Lord, would you bless our time together here? Would you speak to us in ways that we can receive on a difficult topic, and oftentimes very confusing in some ways, and truly has always been countercultural. And so, God, we invite you here now. Broken promises, broken hearts. Matthew 5:27 through 37. And these are the topics that we're going to cover. Adultery. The verses are listed where this will appear. So you can see adultery comes up multiple times. Adultery, lust, and then a radical cure prescribed for those conditions if you have fallen prey to them. And moving on to divorce and closing with oaths. So we begin then with adultery. Adultery. We often refer to a love affair or an affair. Maybe not us so much, but it's the common term that is so often then associated with adultery. It's that thing on the side you have going, someone has going. It's a secret thing. It's an unfaithful thing. It's an evil thing. Because the heart that was promised here, the promises made are then turned somewhere else, leaving a broken heart here. And oftentimes the stats show that within a year or two, that one has fallen apart as well. Extramarital, conversation, all kinds of things that show up under the idea of adultery. And Jesus addresses it in the Sermon on the Mount like this, right off the top. Very first words after he's talked about the purpose of the law, and he's talked about if you hate someone else, you've actually committed murder, and so on and so forth, as you recall that we have already covered. Now he's going to talk about another aspect of our personal or interpersonal relationships. This one between a man and a woman. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Well, he's quoting from Exodus 20:14 there, which if you have ever wondered, that's where you're going to find the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, given on Mount Sinai to Moses from God. And these I've recently spoken on and referred to as the moral commandments, when Jesus talks about the law being perpetual, in particular the moral commandments. Jesus fulfills these, and he draws our attention to them. You have heard that it was said, you know this stuff, you shall not commit adultery. It comes from the law of Moses, and I'm just going to define it a little bit. Adultery was forbidden in the Ten Commandments. That was forbidden right there, right up front in the law. There's Moses. He looks a lot like Charlton Heston, doesn't he? I've noticed that. Back in Bible days, multiple wives were not uncommon. And concubines. In fact, if you were of any stature, if you were a king or somebody of any stature, you had both. David did, and his son Solomon really broke all records for his accumulation of women, wives, and concubines. So adultery in that culture wasn't a far stretch, as you can imagine. You've got multiple wives, you've got concubines, you're free to indulge all of these things. And so it's not a great stretch to find that Jesus needs to talk about these things. He's talking about them for our benefit. That was a male-dominated culture also, and there's still remnants of that in our own culture. Adultery with a married woman was another matter. Women weren't having these multiple relationships so much unless they were prostitutes, and they were branded as such. They were outcasts as such. You'll recall that a woman was brought before Jesus, thrown at his feet, and they say this woman was caught in adultery. Well, where was the man? What's the deal with that? Because the penalty prescribed was death to both. They wanted to stone her. They were ready to stone her, but where was the man? So there was something put in place to protect our human tendencies, and Jesus is going to talk about that also. Also, as you know, a betrothed woman was counted as a wife, treated as a wife. And so when Joseph thought that his fiancée Mary was pregnant by another man, which would seem to be the obvious thing, until an angel informed him otherwise, he sought to put her away quietly. He could have followed other convention that would have allowed him to humiliate her, shame her. I don't know how often it was done, but even put her to death if he had wanted to enforce the law. And maybe the Pharisees would have insisted, well, that's the only way to go. Well, adultery was forbidden in the Ten Commandments. What happened here? It's also a metaphor. Adultery is used as a metaphor for spiritual unfaithfulness with God. You've heard it many times, and here's one of the references to that. Then in the nations where they have been carried captive, talking about Israel, those who escape will remember me, how I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes which have lusted after their idols. Adultery was used as a metaphor for general spiritual unfaithfulness. Adultery, the prohibition against adultery, involves sexual intercourse with mutual consent between a man and a woman. It's not rape. It's a mutual consent between a man and a woman, whether they're married or unmarried. Actually, it says here between a man, married or unmarried, and the wife of another man. So you get the picture there. Adultery was a sexual intercourse agreed upon by both partners between a man and another man's wife. The penalty, death, applied equally to both men and women, and a betrothed woman was counted as a wife, as I just said. Who might this be? Any idea? King David. It was a springtime when kings go out to war, and David stayed back. He had a very competent military force that could do this thing. David stayed back, and while he's up on his roof one day, he spots a woman, a beautiful woman, bathing. Probably behind her fence, and maybe another woman even helping her if she was a woman of any stature. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She is a person. She's not an object. She's the daughter of Eliam. And she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And if you know the story, when she recognizes that she's pregnant, David commands Joab, I think it is, to have Uriah brought to the front line and go into battle and then have the troops withdraw. He was one of David's mighty men, sent out to vanquish the enemy, and David cheats with his wife and then betrays him. Now, it's described as being by mutual consent, but what could Bathsheba say if the king sends for her? What could she really say? I want to make some allowance for that possibility. And then there's Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now, this is an entirely different way that this one plays out. You know about that. Joseph and Potiphar's wife, he's been sold by his brothers. He finds favor as he helps. He finds favor. He's bought by Potiphar, and he does such a good job that Potiphar puts him in charge of his whole household. And I think Potiphar had what we might call a trophy bride. He might have been some ugly old cuss that had power and found himself this beautiful trophy bride, and she noticed in David something that was very appealing. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him how? Lustfully. And she said, "Come and sleep with me." In fact, it says she demanded, "You work for me. You work for this household. Come and sleep with me." But Joseph had a different character, and he's shown this way. One day he went, this is a subsequent thing. So notice that the first one is in 6 and 7, and now this continues on, and now we're in verse 11 and 12, and it says, "One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside." I wonder if she arranged for that. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. And I think he says there, "How could I sin against my master and against God?" Well, that's because he recognized, Joseph was a very honorable man, and he recognized that his body belongs to God, not to Potiphar's wife. His service belongs to Potiphar. Your body, our bodies belong to God. This is a really important point here, because it's going to help us to put adultery and the lust that leads to it into the proper context. The body, it says in 1 Corinthians 6:13 through 20, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. What a wonderful exchange. Our body, created by the Lord, is for the Lord, and the Lord is for us. He's for our bodies. And here's where that's going to lead to. And then it promises that God raised the Lord Jesus and will also raise us up by his power. It's expanding on what's ahead for us as part of the body of Christ. And he says then, "Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute?" He's giving a very rational, Paul is a very rational person, and he's giving a sequential teaching here. And this is what he says. And then he continues. He says, I want to read this again. I'm going to read this again. "Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of a prostitute? Never. Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, The two will become one flesh. Meant between a man and a wife. Yet the same condition exists. You've abandoned your wife, and now you've given your body, your one flesh, to another, and it never really belonged to you in that way. Once you were redeemed, it belongs to God. So you're bringing God into an illicit relationship that He forbids. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with Him, bigger than just our bodies. Well, the upshot of it all is to flee from sexual immorality, and that's what's depicted here in this picture of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. He flees, and his cloak is left behind. He slips out of his cloak, and then, of course, he pays a price for that because she claims he tried to rape her. This is a continuation of what we just read, or what I just read from 1 Corinthians 6. Every other sin a man can commit is outside his body. But he who sins sexually sins against his own body. He's saying this is a particularly evil sin. We often say all sins are of the same caliber or strata. This doesn't seem to particularly follow that line of thinking. I would like to think that since we're all sinners by nature, and since even the smallest thing is an offense against God, I'd like to think that an Adolf Hitler, that his sins are of a little different strata than many others. But he who sins sexually sins against his own body, because we're joined with Christ, we're one with the Lord, and now we have defiled that bond, that union. And it goes on, don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price. So you must honor God with your body. It's 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20 there. We're going to come back to what Jesus said, repeating that very first verse to get everything in context here. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. We see the reference to Exodus, to the Ten Commandments. And he's going to respond to that, or he's going to build on that. You've already heard this, you know this. It's been repeated for years and years and years. For those of you who can read, you've read it. But he says, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. It's a hard teaching. A hard teaching for men. It's a teaching to men about how they might look at a woman as an object. I remember a Christian brother early in my walk was saying that we need to look, when we see a woman, we need to think of her as our sister. Right? Now, unless you're inclined towards incest, you wouldn't even consider that woman is an object for your fleshly satisfaction. I tell you, anyone that looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. I think there's some qualifications on this. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But it's talking about looking at her lustfully. I think that would mean you're starting to imagine some things. You're starting to yield to the temptation. I grab pictures and things from YouTube a lot, and if you're on the internet, you are exposed to a lot of things, and it would be really easy to click and take another look. I consider myself fortunate. There was not pornography in the home that I grew up with. I know of boys, men who have been exposed to that, and something happens. Something happens to them chemically in their brains and in their hearts. And men are much more physically oriented than women are to start with. And so it really, really has a terrible price because it's an addictive kind of a thing. And so I consider myself fortunate that it's not so hard. I won't say that I don't have to be present to make a decision, but it's not so hard to move on. Because I know the danger that's there. I know that I'm not above being tempted like any other person. So I think there's a qualification here. It doesn't say that you can never look at a woman. I'd have to be talking to you like this. Many of you. Well, the Ten Commandments addresses the deeper roots of adultery. Covetousness. We're going to talk about covetousness because that also is in the Ten Commandments. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not commit adultery. Later on, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, someone married to another man. But it goes further than that on the subject of covetousness. So what is covetousness? What is it? When you covet after something, it's to stretch oneself to reach after a thing with special reference to the thing or object desired. Well, that's kind of challenging by itself because there might be plenty of things that you desire. We desired to do some remodeling work in our kitchen, and we had to stretch ourselves in order to make all the decisions and arrangements and pay for that. So I think it must be more than just the way we could apply this broadly. It's to long after. It's to try to gain something now. That can be a form of idolatry also. You can be so fixated on things, on accumulations, on being a consumer, that you fall into or you pursue idolatry. And I think that's all part of this as well. It's a having more, never satisfied. The will to have more. In other words, a larger portion, a larger house, a bigger car, have the advantage, have the superiority over someone else. In plural, covetous thoughts involve plans of theft. They can. Someone can covet something so much that they just help themselves to it. A kleptomaniac is a person who really has an awful hard time resisting. That's there. Nobody's looking. Now it's here. Fraud, extortion. How can I cheat? How can I get away with it? Who will ever know? I'll be gone. The 10th commandment, you shall not covet. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. I want to expand on this. First again, once your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. There's a whole bunch of things, or his male slave, or his female slave, or his ox or his donkey, or covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. Let your neighbor have what he has. Let that be his, and don't allow yourself to get caught up in the desire for that. We're talking about how covetousness relates to adultery, and now we're going to talk about lust. Jesus is going to talk about lust. We're just looking at the text, expanding on that a little bit to broaden our concepts and understanding. It's classified then as usually intense or unbridled sexual desire. That's the way we're going to look at lust here, or the way that Jesus is focusing on it. Intense, unbridled, that means you're not restraining yourself. You're giving yourself into it. That desire. And so lust and adultery I classify as kissing cousins, like flame and fuel. The one fuels the other, and it goes up in flames, a roaring inferno. Lust begins with just a look. Just a look. Do you know these people? It's not a passing glance, but it's a willful, calculated stare that arouses sexual desire. Then that look can lead to inappropriate solicitous remarks. You want a walnutto? You know, maybe you'll think of something else. Now it's really dangerous these days because of the Me Too movement. Men. And I think all of us are quite aware of that. And hopefully none of us were so inclined to fall into this trap that it's exceptionally difficult for us. But here where I said I think we need to qualify the nature of covetousness and lust and all of that somewhat separately from adultery. We've seen this now, and I think you grasp that. How about a simple appreciation for beauty? Does this mean then that you can't simply appreciate beautiful things? I'd like to think that there is a qualifying idea there, that we're talking about that sexual desire and not just an appreciation of beautiful things. Classic beauty. For instance, there's a rose, a beautiful rose. Is it not beautiful? Can you not look at it and admire it for its color, its form, for what it represents? How about a lovely pendant necklace? Ladies, they don't really attract me that much. So if you're trying to attract me with your lovely, beautiful pendant, I might give it a passing glance, but Nancy would love if I loved them. If I would go into the jewelry store with her and look at them. How about this? How about a classic Mustang? Is that not a thing of beauty? Even with its rather rectangular and square lines, if you see that, wouldn't you want it? Yep. Would you lust after it? Would you say, oh, I'd give anything to have that if I could afford it? How about this? How about appreciating things hot and curvy? Beautiful form. I think you get where I'm going with this. It doesn't mean that you have to fall into lust. It doesn't mean that you have to become covetous. It means that you can appreciate. I often drive by a car and give it a second look or something and give it a second look without it becoming more than that. And so there's a question here. Is that appreciation? Is that just appreciation? Or is it lust? Is it covetousness? Or am I just rationalizing? I ask myself that question. Am I just rationalizing because I too am attracted to beautiful things? Doesn't mean that I have to lust sexually after a beautiful woman. Doesn't mean I can't look at my sister and say, she's so pretty. I love my sister. There's a healthy way and an unhealthy way. So, there's a book called Every Man's Battle. And so the question then, are you still struggling with every man's battle? And there's nothing unusual about it. You don't belong in a freak show because you have this proclivity to be drawn to a beautiful woman, a hot and curvy woman. There's nothing unusual about that, but do you struggle with it as a temptation that leads you off into the other realm? I like this picture. I like the way the woman that's with him is looking at him like, are you for real? He's not subtle at all, is he? Not subtle at all. try copying Job. In regards to that, try copying Job's lustful covetousness covenant. Some of you may know what that is. Here's what Job said. And I wonder if it was when he was, the whole story about Job is we meet him in a beaten down stage. Everything is horrible in his life. And I wonder if that's where he considered some of these things. It says that he was a very righteous man, but you know what? Even a very righteous man is just a man. Well, Job made a covenant with himself, with part of himself, with his body, so that he wouldn't sin in his body. And his covenant is, I made a covenant with my eyes, not to look lustfully at a young woman. I made a deal with my eyes that when I see that, and if I feel that rising in me, I'm going to close my eyes. I'm going to avert my eyes. I'm going to look the other way. One technique I know that has been somewhat effective is that a person who has that tendency will wear a thick rubber band on their wrist. And when they do that, they go snap. Kind of just a behavioral modifying reminder that, ouch, that's not good for me, and I got to remind myself, and I'm going to use any best tool I can. I'm going to put filters on my internet. I'm going to call someone when I fall into that temptation. I'm going to be part of a group of men who can talk about that and deal with that, because I know I'm not alone. Because I want to make a covenant with my eyes, and my covenant ultimately is with God, and my covenant is an agreement, a respectful, pure agreement with others that we're struggling together with this problem, and we can help one another. This is from Job. So, with all the things Job's going through, this fits in there. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. Maybe he was counting his strengths. God couldn't be doing that to me for this. I made a deal with myself. I couldn't be here in sackcloth and ashes and covered with boils, scraping myself with a potsherd because I would look lustfully at a young woman. His friends all accused him of some kind of a hidden sin. But that's not it. Well, there's a radical cure Jesus is going to give to us now. He says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. So he's saying the consequences are desire, and the cure is radical. Of course, there's hyperbole here. Not that, all right, I'm looking, I find myself driving by the schoolyard and I'm looking at the high school girls, and so I'm going to cut my eye out, pluck my eye out. There's hyperbole to emphasize the importance of this, because he associates it with you're committing your whole body to a very, very bad trajectory that is hellbound. This is really strange. And I don't know how accurately I can tell the story, but some of you know who Adam Sanders is. How many know Adam Sanders? Adam Sanders, yeah. A good friend of Donnell and Venda's, and someone who lived in Aromas, and someone who has spoken in our church and been part of our worship team. He had a brother that had a pretty serious psychological problem and an alcohol problem. And in an extreme effort, he stopped doing that, but he still had the problem. And they're a religious family, and so his brother became part of a church, unfortunately, that was very legalistic and literalistic. And his brother was found to have chopped his hand off with an axe. This family were all woodcutters up in the north, up in the Weed area. He cut his hand off with an axe, and the police came And because he had an axe, they shot and killed him. And so Adam and the family are, hey, what's up with this? You couldn't have taken another action? But this is, I say it's a really strange story, not something you hear of every day, but people sometimes take these things in too literal a form and miss the fact that Jesus is saying, this is really important, so I want to get your attention with it. Pluck out your eye and throw it away. Say what? I need my eye. I promise I won't look at her anymore. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. He's prescribing some radical treatment. You know, there might be something you need to cut off. Something in a sense that you need to stop doing that puts you in the proximity of temptation. Just stop thinking you can get close and still be safe. I think that's what Jesus is saying. So lust and adultery, he's going to move on now. It's the doorway to divorce. Lust and adultery will often lead to divorce. Adultery, lust, a radical cure. These are the things we've talked about. Now we're going to look at divorce. It has been said, Jesus is saying this, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Don't just leave her and leave her vulnerable. She needs to have closure that you have divorced her. Now, the reasons were extrapolated to be almost anything. And so the Pharisees are going to come to Jesus, and they're going to say, some Pharisees came to him to test him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Because this had become the practice. And they're wondering, well, you know, and it says they came to test him. And they want to see if they can trap him in saying something that they can use against him. Is it lawful? I don't like her breath in the morning, so I don't want this one around. Besides, there's another one over there that appeals to me. Whatever it might be, something really stupid. And so they ask this question, and then they say, why then? Did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? If it's not legal to do that for any and every reason, why did Moses command us to give her a certificate of divorce? Jesus responds to the question, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. God knew the nature of humankind. God knew the nature of a man and every man's battle and every man's tendency to use the woman as an object and then to abandon her. And nowadays, not so many people even get married, but women get pregnant and the man is gone. She trusted him, she gave herself to him, or maybe she was as wanton as he was, and these were just the consequences. But Moses permitted, he's telling these Pharisees, these guys should know this. Moses permitted, he didn't command you to divorce your wives, he permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality and marries another woman, commits adultery. Now, this is in Matthew 19. He's just said this very last part in the Sermon on the Mount, back in chapter 5. So this is a repeated theme that Jesus is getting across to the people about a very serious matter in that day. And he wanted to make sure that women had the same benefits as men did. So, what about abandonment? It's really a tough situation for pastors to address this problem with a couple. And I know one pastor has said, well, abandonment is also a reason for divorce. Your husband has left. You don't know if there's sexual immorality or not. It's not beyond the possibility, but he just left. What am I supposed to do? I'm still obligated to him by marriage. What am I supposed to do? Well, here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, 8 through 15. And it's pretty dense. But he says this. He says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Some translations say lust. It's better to marry. If you can't control yourself, it's better to marry. He's talking to women now and widows. To the married, now for those who are married, I give this charge. Not I. This isn't just my idea, but the Lord. I get this from the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. That's a tough one. The woman should not separate from her husband. Here, I would say for virtually any reason except sexual immorality. And the husband should not divorce his wife. The big idea here is that this is not God's plan and God's design. That men and women should be caught up in lust and covetousness and sexual immorality and throw away marriage. To the rest, I say, you're not divorced, you're not a widow, you're not single. To the rest of you, I say, Paul clarifies, I'm saying this. I'm not saying thus saith the Lord here. This is how I look at it. That if any brother has a wife, now brother meaning another believer, who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. So here's a married man, and his wife is an unbeliever. Or here's a married, believing man, and his wife is not a believer. And if she's willing to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. You don't have a good reason just to throw the marriage away. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Verse 15, talking about abandonment and separation. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. That's a really big part of all of this. God has called us to live in peace. And so if your unbelieving partner is willing to live with you, let it be so. If they abandon you, you're not to be enslaved. God wants us to live in peace. And so he made these conditions that a certificate of divorce should be given so that if the man is initiating this divorce, and that's the way it worked, the woman would have recourse. Now we're going to talk about oaths. Jesus has taken us through all of this, and he says this, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. You know, when you get married, you make a vow. He's saying, I think he would be saying, be careful of the vows you make. Give serious consideration. Do not because. I'll read it from the beginning. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. I have turned down doing weddings along the way, and just had to explain the only kind of wedding I can do is between a man and a woman and God. If you just want somebody to do the whatever, There's plenty of people who will. There's plenty of people who rent their churches out as a wedding chapel. You can go to Tahoe or Reno or Las Vegas if you want to have. You can have Elvis marry you. You know? So if that's all you want is just a little ritual in a quaint little church, I'm not the guy for you. The marriage vows are between the man, the woman before God, and the witnesses. Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. And he goes on, he says, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all. I don't think that means don't have wedding vows. I don't think so. Don't swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. He's saying, if you're going to use God in your oath in such a way that it's going to validate what you're saying, but you're not really an honest person, if you're going to say something like, trust me, I swear on my mother's grave. I've never said that. I don't know that I've ever even heard it, but I know that it's a common enough phrase. And that you've got to convince someone. You've got to give them something dramatic to cover the fact that you're really not an honest person. Or, I swear on my mother's grave, this one's supposed to be, I swear on a stack of Bibles. Or swear on a stack of Bibles. That's somehow or other going to legitimize your oath, your words, make them believable.
You've heard, cross my heart, hope to die.
Yeah.
Stick a needle in my eye.
That last part I've missed. Cross my heart, hope to die if I should ever tell a lie, but stick a needle in my eye. There's the consequences if I should lie. And do not swear by your head. You know, don't swear. Don't make an oath to convince someone that what you're saying is true, to manipulate them to believe you just because it serves you in some way. Because you can't make a hair on your head white or black. You can make it red. Right? Well, see, in that day, they must not have been able to do that. His point is, you know what? Don't swear by anything. Just, here it is. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Let your yes, I love this, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's how we commonly would think this particular passage. Let your yes be yes. Just a simple yes. Yes, I will. And I'm feeling a bit guilty because Nancy and I called Mary Garcia, talked with her daughter some weeks ago, and that we would try to come by, or we would come by that next week, and we haven't done it. And you know what? It's not a good thing, because if she was looking at all towards us coming over to brighten their day, they don't go out much. Mary was a member of our congregation, and she's in a wheelchair now and in poor health. Her daughter has come down from Sacramento to care for her, and we need to get over there, because our yes was a no. Our yes was a maybe. Our yes lacked substance. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. That means we were too busy with other more important things in our mind. And you know, whenever I think about that, I don't want you to call that, oh, Mary passed away. And I missed that opportunity that was probably God-given, that, you know what, it would be good to look in on this person. Broken promises, broken hearts. That's the sum of this message. That we have to be careful. We have to be aware that our promises define our character. That people look to what we say and they judge whether we're legit or not by whether we follow through. And here, this emphasis here, of course, was on marriage and on covetousness and adultery and the things that lead to breaches in our relationships with the person that is closest to us or meant to be closest to us. The two shall become one flesh. We heard it in the song. For this reason, a woman shall leave her mother, and a man shall take a wife, and the two shall become one. So we're going to have a closing song here, and it's one where you can affirm whether you go along with this business or not. And if you want to sing it, then here it is. Yeah? Okay. I heard it there for a second.